Are the Gulf states no longer just bystanders in the confrontation between the US and Iran? In recent days and hours, Iran's neighbours have come under fire as tensions flare over the Strait of Hormuz. Kuwait says border posts and an offshore oil platform were attacked on Sunday. Qatar says 3 people were injured by shrapnel from an intercepted missile. Now, Iran has claimed strikes on both countries. In addition, Oman, Bahrain and Jordan have also been hit. Tehran says it was targeting US military bases and facilities in retaliation for US attacks. The US military said it has hit well over 100 targets. Now, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards released this footage, claiming that it's showing missiles and drones being launched. The fallout is being felt across the region. Oman has formally protested against Iranian strikes. Qatar has suspended non-commercial maritime activities, and there are growing security concerns over key shipping routes and energy infrastructure. But Gulf countries are still urging the US and Iran not to abandon negotiations, only 4 weeks into the Memorandum of Understanding that was supposed to end their war. So there's a lot to break down, to say the least. And to help me do that, let's bring in Megan Sutcliffe. Megan is an analyst for the Middle East and Africa at the private intelligence firm Sibylline in London. Megan, great to see you again, and really great to have you on the show. Let me start with Qatar. They've suspended non-commercial maritime activities until further notice. Now, is that a sign that Gulf states are moving from, say, watching this conflict to actively preparing for its consequences?
I would say that this is a move from Qatar that does show more active engagement with the conflict when it comes to Iran. Non-commercial and general commercial maritime activity only recently resumed between Qatar and Iran, and that was broadly under an umbrella of negotiations, of discussions between Iran and Qatar that both parties have worked towards achieving, which primarily Qatar was seeking assurances that Iran would not re-engage in its pattern of attacks targeting various US military facilities or various other key parts of Qatar's infrastructure and facilities within the country should the conflict re-escalate. It's very clear that Iran does not seek to hold to those promises and to refrain from attacking Qatar, and therefore we've seen Qatar walking back its commitments to Iran and potentially engaging in an unprecedented level of engagement with this conflict now.
I want to come back to that, but what we've seen so far is that Gulf countries have shown restraint, right, throughout the crisis. Can we sort of get into the reasons why that has been the case?
Absolutely. So throughout the course of the conflict between the US, Israel and Iran, we did not see direct Gulf engagement, although it is notable that following the signature of the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran, it was subsequently disclosed that the UAE and Saudi Arabia had engaged in very limited direct strikes targeting Iran and Iran's proxies in Iraq, respectively. But broadly speaking, the Gulf monarchies showed a great degree of restraint when it came to engaging in hostilities targeting Iran following 6 weeks of really quite intense Iranian attacks targeting a variety of locations within the Gulf. The reasons that they did this are likely threefold. The first is that, of course, the United States and Israel engaged in the conflict with Iran with a set of cooperational military activities. The Gulf was not privy to those planning exercises and was not privy to those military campaigns. And so joining into that campaign would have been technically rather complex, but also politically very, very challenging for many of the Gulf states that, of course, have not normalized relations with Israel. It's also notable that there has been a lack of clarity over what exactly the United States' end goals were when it came to the war with Iran. And so for the Gulf monarchies to join into a military campaign without a clear set of end goals, that also would have been very risky from a capabilities and an economic standpoint. Another option that the Gulf monarchies had, of course, was to join in as a unified front, essentially form some kind of coalition to intervene in Iran. That is no small task. There are a variety of perspectives within the Gulf monarchies regarding what should and could be done regarding Iran. And it was very clear that during the conflict, no one entity was able to bridge those different gaps. So the only option remaining for some of the Gulf monarchies was unilateral action, essentially taking on Iran. And that would have been extremely risky. It is still extremely risky because during the course of the conflict, we saw Iran managing to disrupt several key sectors within the Gulf. We saw attacks targeting extremely valuable infrastructure like airports or the Ras Laffan LNG facility, for example, in Qatar. And that was when Iran was targeting numerous states on a daily basis. In a situation in which a singular Gulf monarchy intervened and targeted Iran, Iran would likely concentrate all of its retaliation onto that particular state. And that could be absolutely devastating from an economic perspective, from a military perspective, and from the perspective of civilians who, of course, would bear the brunt of that retaliation. That left the Gulf in a very tight spot. And that's likely why we've seen that degree of restraint, at least thus far.
You're painting an incredibly complex picture there for the Gulf states. So on some level, are they sort of hostages to the conflict between Tehran and Washington, would you say?
Well, I think that there is certainly a lot of pressure on the Gulf states, and this is a very challenging situation to navigate. But I wouldn't necessarily characterize them as hostages because that essentially takes away their agency to act as states with their own set of goals. And we saw Saudi Arabia engaging in airstrikes targeting Iranian proxies in Iraq during the conflict. We also saw the Emiratis, for example, essentially targeting an oil refinery on the Larak Island in southern Iran at the end of the conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran. So there is a degree of capability and of agency there when it comes to the Gulf monarchies. And we've also seen that manifesting through diplomatic channels following the cessation of active hostilities between the US and Iran. It is well known in foreign policy circles that representatives from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from the Emirates, and even from Oman regularly have met with representatives from Iran in order to secure those assurances that they will not necessarily be targeted or targeted as intensely should hostilities resume. Obviously, that's not a concrete guarantee and not something that has precluded any kind of hostilities. However, it is notable that in this situation, the Gulf monarchies thus far seem to be preferring a diplomatic track as opposed to one that relies solely on military confrontation.
Now, I want to bring in a post here that was posted earlier on X by the US Central Command. And they said that its forces began launching more strikes against Iran to continue degrading their ability to attack civilian mariners and commercial ships freely transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The commander-in-chief has directed the strikes to hold Iranian forces accountable. I want to get your take on what they're saying here and how do you read this statement from US Central Command?
Well, what this statement essentially outlines is that over the next few days, we are highly likely to see the US continuing to engage in limited airstrike campaigns targeting Iran's southern coastline, as well as various parts of its military-industrial complex. Essentially, a concerted effort from the United States to undermine Iran's capacity to produce and deploy the munitions that have allowed it to essentially close the Strait of Hormuz through a soft blockade, essentially through threats targeting vessels that are then backed up by periodic hostilities, like the attacks we saw targeting commercial vessels last week that essentially triggered this entire confrontational episode between the United States and Iran. That, of course, is a risky strategy because even though we have seen US President Donald Trump saying that the memorandum of understanding between the US and Iran is, quote, essentially dead in the water, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ceasefire has been completely nullified. Yes, we have seen an uptick in exchanges between the US and Iran, but we have not seen them reaching the intensity that we saw during the active conflict phase. However, if the United States does continue to engage in broader and broader airstrikes targeting Iran's naval capabilities and its military-industrial complex, the likelihood of a more intense Iranian retaliation is going to increase. Each time that we are seeing fire being exchanged between the US and Iran, there is a risk of miscalculation, of target misidentification, or munitions malfunctioning, for example. All of that potentially pushes us closer to the point at which these tensions boil over and we do see conflict resumption between the US and Iran. For the Gulf, that would be essentially an economic nightmare, because all of the damage that was done during the initial phase of the conflict could well be compounded in that scenario. And of course, the Strait of Hormuz is almost certainly not going to open if we do see a resumption of active hostilities.
Now, I just want to return to everything that we've been saying here about, the Gulf states and Iran, and I want to look sort of a little bit at their relations right now. How badly do you think this recent escalation has damaged relations between Tehran and the Gulf states?
It's certainly shaken the relations between Iran and the Gulf states. Of course, if we go back 5 or 6 months before the conflict began, Iran had experienced a period of relative tensions with several states in the region, but was in a position of power. It had active relations with Oman, it had relatively solid relations with Qatar, it had a working economic relationship with the UAE, and following the rapprochement in 2023, there was also a working relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, all of those relations, of course, had their pitfalls. Nothing was perfect before the conflict began. However, after Iran began retaliating to US airstrikes by targeting the Gulf, essentially we saw those relations really, really sour. Looking, for example, at the case of the UAE, we saw the Emirati authorities increasingly scrutinizing Iranian-linked investment and financial flows through major financial hubs, of course, like Dubai, which has been used for many decades by Iran as essentially a way to access the international economy, but also to spend money in an area where sanctions potentially are not quite as crippling as they are in other locations. That type of pressure, of course, was not taken well by Tehran, and that's possibly why we saw Iran targeting the UAE so intensely during the active phase of this conflict. And all of that spoke to a broader distrust of Tehran when it came to the Gulf monarchies. Now, following the conflict, we have seen several states like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, and the UAE engaging diplomatically with Tehran. But the background and the context to that diplomatic contact is very, very different to what it was before the conflict. As opposed to an effort to normalize relations, to essentially calm things down and build a better relationship with Tehran and several of its Gulf neighbors, now the relationship is based on essentially the Gulf nations attempting to protect themselves against what they view as an actively dangerous regime that can and will resume hostilities, targeting its economic weak points at any point in time, should it view hostilities to be boiling over. That's something that's very concerning. It changes the diplomatic tone in the region, and it certainly changes the trajectory of those relations going forward.
I want to stick with that, what you just said about the diplomatic tone, because I want to bring in as well a post on X from Mohammed Khalibaf, that's Iran's chief negotiator. He says the era of one-sided deals is over. We told you, keep your word or pay the price. Reality is knocking. Pretty strong statement there from Mohammed Khalibaf. What I want to know is, he's been a leading negotiator and also one of the strongest voices threatening retaliation. So what does his role actually tell us about how Iran is balancing diplomacy and escalation?
This is a pretty typical statement from Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf. He is the Speaker of Parliament for Iran, but he has also been one of the chief negotiators when it comes to the ceasefire between the United States and Iran. But he's also been one of the most vocal critics of the United States when it has engaged in activities that Iran views as violating the ceasefire or its general ceasefire commitments. So I wouldn't necessarily view that statement as being completely out of character or indicative of a major shift when it comes to the dynamic between the United States and Iran. Rather, I would see it as a continuation of what is a concerning trend that is extremely low trust between the negotiating parties representing Washington, D.C. and those representing Tehran. A lack of trust and diplomatic contact between those parties is always going to be a hindrance when it comes to the peaceful resolution of conflicting interests in a region. And so if we continue to see those types of statements from individuals like Khalibaf, like the Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, for example, or from hardline media outlets within Iran that are associated with the IRGC, for example, all of that speaks to the diminishing prospects for a major diplomatic breakthrough, the potential lapsing of the current ceasefire, and the potential for a resumption of conflict in a region that, of course, over the past 6 months has already seen a great deal of conflict.
I want to bring in Oman to the equation here. Now, they've long acted as like a bridge, I suppose, between Iran and the West. Now, they've also come under attack. So can it still play that mediating role, considering what we've seen?
It's certainly challenging. Of course, Oman has often been sort of the cornerstone of diplomacy between the United States and Iran. They were one of the mediators for the 2015 JCPOA, or nuclear deal. And so the fact that they have been attacked by Iran is almost unprecedented, and it is extremely concerning for Muscat and for the Sultanate itself. However, I wouldn't necessarily see that as being completely contradictory when it comes to Oman's efforts to mediate. Oman is not going to be quick to abandoning that role because it has allowed Oman to carve out a very specific niche within the region as a very geopolitically important and significant player. Therefore, it is likely that we will continue to see Oman mediating discussions or attempting to play an active role in mediation. However, the cost of that mediation will likely increase. There will likely be an understanding that Oman deserves further concessions for having accepted essentially those shocks while also continuing to follow the path of diplomacy. That will again add to the complexity of any given agreement between the United States and Iran to extend the ceasefire. And that's, of course, before we even begin considering the relations between Muscat and Tehran in the context of administering the Strait of Hormuz. Under the ceasefire, they are both given an official role in that particular administration. And so if we're seeing increasingly conflicting relations between the two, that potentially, again, throws us into another sea of uncertainty when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and what that strategic picture is going to look like as we head into the second part of 2026.
Yeah, so much uncertainty, Megan. It's almost overwhelming in some ways, what you're saying to us. So Tehran has also insisted it's targeting US military facilities, right, rather than the Gulf states themselves. So I'm curious to know how central American bases are in the Gulf to Iran's strategy.
They're absolutely central to Iran's strategy at the moment because essentially when it comes to the way that Iran has engaged in this conflict and attempted to retaliate to the United States, of course, the Gulf monarchies have borne the brunt of that retaliation. Now, Iran characterizes its retaliation as primarily targeting American military installations or American and Israeli interests within the Gulf. Now, that's not strictly true because just today we have seen, for example, the targeting of offshore Kuwaiti energy facilities that have nothing to do with the US military. And so it's not exactly a watertight definition from Tehran. But if we look exclusively at US military bases, there are several reasons as to why they have been so central to Iran's retaliation. The first is that they are within reach of the vast majority of Iran's munitions, and that means they are something that can be routinely targeted. Secondly, they fit into essentially Iran's strategy of asymmetric warfare, because by sending over several dozen drones and one or two missiles at a time, Iran essentially triggers what are very, very expensive air defense systems that guard these facilities. And so by sending out very low-cost munitions and triggering a much higher cost response, Iran is equally engaging in an economic war of attrition that is able to, in their view, grind down US interest in this particular conflict and therefore undermine American engagement in the region. The third way in which US military installations are central to Iran's strategy in the region is, of course, because Iran has long had the aspiration of removing US military installations from the region. Essentially, they view this as an overstep of American power. It's something that is not compatible with Iran's foreign policy and defense doctrine. And therefore, they are aiming to remove these bases. By routinely targeting these areas and by undermining the sense of security and the economic stability of the Gulf monarchies, essentially what Iran aims to do is to shift their calculus, to make it seem to the Gulf monarchies that these bases are simply too expensive for them in terms of opportunity cost and in terms of direct cost to maintain, to continue allowing the US to operate. If they were to change those decisions, reduce the US's presence, for example, reduce their cooperation, Iran would view that as a net benefit. And so that's likely why, part of the reason at least, we have seen such intense targeting of these facilities, not just during the active phase of this conflict, but also, of course, under the Memorandum of Understanding and preceding ceasefire.
Yeah, I want to kind of go back to a couple of things that we've spoken about at the top of our interview. We were mentioning Qatar, that they've suspended non-commercial maritime activities until further notice. We spoke about the economic impact of this, and I really want to go back to that because, of course, the Gulf states have presented themselves now for many, many years as stable economic hubs. How much damage is this conflict doing to them? Because, a few months ago we spoke about this, and then, of course, things sort of calmed down in recent weeks, and now things are picking up again. So, really, is this something of deep, deep concern there?
It is certainly very concerning because, of course, the way that many of the Gulf monarchies have adapted their economies to the way that the global economy is working at the moment is essentially by attempting to diversify their economies away from a primary dependence on energy exports towards investment in things like major hospitality events, in tourism, serving as a global travel hub, as a destination, but also a thoroughfare for individuals transiting from America and Europe into East Asia, but also as a very business-friendly destination, whether we're looking at general commerce or we're looking at, say, property investments. Iran's attacks targeting the Gulf monarchies have shaken every part of that economic mix and has undermined the trajectory of this diversification drive that we have seen in many of the Gulf states over the past few years. If we look at energy, for example, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has significantly disrupted the movement of oil and gas, as well as several other commodities, to global buyers. So that's been a major blow. Another area is, of course, this idea of being a reliable business environment, one to which individuals can freely travel to and from, engage in business in a safe and predictable environment. Of course, Iran has shown just how fragile that environment can be. We're also looking at things like hospitality and tourism. Many major events in the Gulf were cancelled during the course of the conflict, not just because of the major travel disruption that was presented by airspace closures and the closures of numerous airports, but also because of the sense of insecurity that many would feel if they were to travel to an area where missiles and drones were routinely targeting high-profile buildings or military installations. So Iran has really shaken that confidence in the diversification drive. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it has totally eradicated confidence in the possibility of that diversification continuing over the next few years. Yes, we have seen cuts to things like property prices in Dubai. We have seen increased vacancies in hotel institutions throughout the region. However, there is still a great degree of travel that is occurring within the Gulf. We've also seen an adaptation of supply chains as many states, such as the UAE, attempt to move various commodities out through alternative port facilities, like those in Fujairah, for example. So there has been adaptation to this increasing trend, but that adaptation itself speaks to the concern that many of the Gulf monarchies have when it comes to just how fragile their economies can and will be in the face of an increasingly empowered and militarily boisterous Iran.
Yeah, certainly. While you were speaking there, we were just seeing live images, actually, of the Strait of Hormuz and the movement, maritime traffic in that area. And I mean, you can kind of clearly see that there's not much happening around the Strait of Hormuz. But like you say, I mean, obviously, it's of deep concern. Now, recently, it was a few weeks ago, Marco Rubio toured the Gulf to reassure US allies. I think we're going to take a listen to what he had to say there, and then I'm going to come back to you, Megan.
And the message that I come with is that we want to ensure that in any decisions that are made throughout this negotiating process, the interests of our partners and our allies in the region are always taken into account. That there is no part of this deal that's undertaken that in any way undermines the security, the stability, or the prosperity of any of our partners in the Gulf region.
All right, well, there was Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. How reassured do you think they're feeling today?
Well, I think that that was a statement from Marco Rubio, whereas the Memorandum of Understanding is something that is far more concrete. And the attacks that Iran has engaged in over the past few days and the past few hours are even more concrete. They're even more demonstrable. And so that is likely what the Gulf monarchies will be interpreting as an indicator of the way in which the region is going to develop, as opposed to a singular statement made by the Secretary of State for the United States. In the next few months, it is going to be quite challenging for the Gulf monarchies to decide exactly what they are going to do with their relations with the United States. There are several options on offer. Some could choose to double down, essentially beef up cooperation with the United States in order to build even more resilience against Iranian hostilities. Others may choose to diversify their relations with other states, like Turkey or Pakistan, for example, and attempt to move away from what some would characterize as a dependence on the United States and its defense umbrella in the region. Others may also choose to stray further afield, for example, building relations with China or with Russia. But all of those present opportunities and also threats to the relationship between the Gulf monarchies and the United States. It is not a choice that anyone in the region will be making lightly, particularly in high policy power circles.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there. Fantastic analysis as always. Megan, thanks so much. Lots to digest there. Megan Sutcliffe from the private intelligence firm Sibylline joining us from London. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So plenty to look at there. We always love to hear from you, so do let us know in the comments, and please remember to like this video. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. I'm Pablo Foley Elias in Berlin. Thanks for watching. Take care.